Good afternoon. My name is Heather Cordell. I'm a high school science teacher at Tennessee Virtual Academy. Today I'm presenting to you on increasing data literacy. Go ahead and use your polling tool. And what grade would you give yourself in data literacy? Also, take a moment to grab my contact information there on the board. Let me take a moment to introduce myself a little bit more. I live in Sevierville, Tennessee with my son and husband. This is my third year with Tennessee Virtual Academy as a lead teacher and science department chair. And in my free time, I enjoy mountain biking, hiking, rock climbing, kayaking, anything outdoors. Today's session goals are to determine the efficacy of student data and use student data to inform instruction. Our agenda is what is data literacy, the process, and then our plans to put it into action. So, what is data literacy? Go ahead and use your whiteboard tools and the space below to define data literacy in your own words. Don't go looking on Google. I want to know what you already know about it. So let's take about 2 minutes to do this. So this is how data literacy is defined. Educators' ability to implement DBDM. DBDM stands for data-based decision making. Data is referred to as data literacy, which we define as educators' ability to set a purpose, collect, analyze, and interpret data, and take instructional action. As educators, we do this daily. We just may not do it to its greatest potential. So here is a data set many of us may be familiar with from Excel. We have our students listed, we have their test grades, but the questions you need to ask yourself is, what is the purpose of this data? Is this the best way to collect this data and organize it as well? What does this data tell us? And what do you do with this data? Once you've looked at it, you've analyzed it, and saw trends, what are you going to do with this? So Kipper and colleagues in research on data intervention to increase data literacy identified 5 components of data literacy. Within that intervention, though, there were 8 steps of data use. So we're going to use these 5 components of data literacy to analyze a set of data that I have to determine if it is useful and if we should continue using it and how we're going to use it. Within those 5 components, though, we are going to be implementing those 8 steps of data use intervention so that we can become data literate. So our first step is to set a purpose. So let's take a look at this data that I have. I'm going to move my picture over there for a moment. And here's a note so that you know. In this data set, we have both qualitative and quantitative data. So there on the board, you can see it says things like on track, mastered, approaching, and below. That is our qualitative data. Our quantitative data, though, is found here in the note. So you'll see that if it's below, that means they got 0 out of 3 correct on this assessment. If they were approaching, 1 out of 3, on track, 2 out of 3, and then mastered 3 out of 3 questions correct. So this is data from Mastery Connect, which we are all currently using in our core classes. So we should be familiar with this layout. So if we are becoming data experts and using data in our classrooms efficiently, we have to start with setting a purpose. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the reason for collecting this data? How will this be used? Why am I collecting this? So we're identifying some problem that may exist or the need to have this data so that we can make instructional changes in our classroom. So with using Mastery Connect, again, because all of our core classes, we use Mastery Connect weekly, what is our reason for collecting this data? Why do we do this? How do we use this data? So as a school and on the individual level, how do we use this data? So let's start as a school. As a school, how do we use this data as a whole school? Now, how do you use this data in your individual classroom? So once we set a purpose, we identify what is the reason for this data or what problem needs to be solved. We moved on to actually collecting the data. So as a school, we identified a problem was that we needed this reliable data to help our students reach mastery of our content standards. So then we found a platform, which we chose Mastery Connect, to collect this data. But in the process of doing this, we had to ask ourselves, is this the best way to collect this data? And what other ways could this data be collected? And this is the same thing you should ask yourself when you are determining what data tool you should use in your classroom. So once you've identified that problem or that reason for collecting data, now let's pick a tool and let's start collecting. So data is collected actually three different times or three different ways. One way could be to understand the problem. That's our pre-assessments to see what our students already know or identify some misconceptions. The second step is to identify answers. This is your post-assessment. So this is we've collected this data for intervention to see what our students already know. We've implemented our instructional strategies and we've reassessed their understanding. That's our post assessment, see what they've really learned. And then that information there from the post assessment also can be used to inform instruction. So both pre assessments and post assessments are used to inform instruction. And this data that's collected is used for all of this with the big goal of making the best decisions for our kids. So when you are choosing your data tool, make sure that you're choosing the best way that is available to you to collect your data. Our next step is to analyze this data. So is this the best way to organize this data? So in Mastery Connect, is this the best way to organize this data? Should I pull this and put it into Excel file, which in Mastery Connect, you can import that directly into an Excel file. Are there other ways that I can organize this data to make it more meaningful to me and easier for me to understand? You also have to ask yourself, is the data complete? We can see there are some gaps. Student number 78, I can see that on two standards they were on track and below, but there's a gap there. Those other two standards I don't know. Same thing with student number 81. I can see they mastered and are approaching two standards, but I can't see what they scored on 1.13 and 1.14. So my data may have some incomplete pieces. I may need to go back before analyzing this data and interpreting it. I need to go back and find those two students to complete those two assessments so that I have complete data. Also, is it accurate? Do I know that these students took it on their own? Do I know the student is the one that actually took it? Given that we're in a virtual environment, sometimes we can't see their faces as they're taking these assessments. So in analyzing the data, you're organizing it and you are preparing to interpret your results so you can make an action plan with those results. So once you've organized it, you've made sure it's complete and accurate and it's ready to move forward, you can then interpret your data. So what does this data tell us? So if we take a closer look at this particular data, it's telling us that student number 98, the first one on the list, is on track for 3 out of 4 standards and have mastered standard 1.14. They are probably ready to move on to a more advanced, more rigorous standard or diving deeper into that content. Student number 06 has mastered even more of those standards. So student 06 might be a good partner for student number 98 to get student number 98 onto mastered of all of those standards. As I continue to look at this, I could see that student 81 is approaching standard 1.12. So is student 25 and student 61. I could maybe use that information to create small groups to go back and reteach standard 1.12 to those students. I can also look at the big picture. As I look down each column, I can see that standard 1.12, there were only 2 that had mastered that standard. Maybe I need to reteach to the whole class with that standard. So this data is telling us a lot of information. So we have to interpret what it is telling us. We could use this data. We could determine the mean or average score, since we know that each of these words here represent a certain number of answers correct, and we can get a percentage from that. We could find standard deviation. We could find other trends and create charts and graphs from this data. And in the process of interpreting it, we find out what our next steps should be. So now we take instructional action. This is the part as teachers we do most often. Oftentimes we take instructional action based off of intuition, and we don't necessarily dig deeper into the data and what's telling us. What's important is that we take those first steps to dig deeper into our data so that we understand it, make sure it is quality data collected with a tool that is useful, collecting what it's supposed to be collecting, and actually gives us something reliable we can create action for. So what are we going to do with this data? And then how will you know if you're successful? So as mentioned on the previous slide, there were a few ideas. Reteaching a standard or pairing people. For example, I could see that student 78 was below on 1.14, but student 99 had mastered 1.14. I could maybe pair them together to help that student gain mastery on that content standard. I could reteach 1.12, or I could see if there's a student that's continually just on track below or approaching. I can help them to better get to mastery of that content standard through more personalized instruction or even personalized curriculum in our online environment. So that's what I'm going to do. Those are my action steps, and I'm going to create different action steps for different students and different standards. And so when that's all done, though, you have to ask yourself, how will you know if you are successful? What measurement criteria are you going to use to know whether or not you're successful? Are you going to have the student retake the exact same assessment? Or are you going to use a different assessment tool? So prepare to reassess those students if they haven't yet mastered that standard. Have a plan for how you're going to determine if they have mastered. Once you've taken action and you've evaluated, this is a continuous process. It never stops. You will consistently evaluate your practice, evaluate the data you're collecting, how you're collecting it, to make sure it's optimal for your environment, and also to make sure that you're providing the best learning environment for your student. So considering everything we just talked about, and again, let's go back. Here is what we went through this process. We set a purpose. Why are we collecting what we're collecting? What is our reason for doing this? Did we choose the best tool in collecting data? Is the data organized now? Is it organized? Is it complete? Is it accurate? We can then interpret it, creating graphs and charts, looking for trends in data, and then take those instructional actions. This is the piece that you do as an educator that people see. What steps are you taking to increase your students' performance? So my last thing I have for you as we leave today is I want you to do next steps. What can you do in the next 5 days to increase your data literacy? Put this on the whiteboard. Now, what can you do in the next 5 weeks to increase your data literacy? Put that on the whiteboard. If you need my contact information, please reach out to me there in private message. Thank you so much for having me. And if you have any questions, you can reach me via email, phone, text. You can call me. Have a wonderful day, and thank you very much.